So I guess let's go to a Q&A time. I've got a first initial question for you, and then we'll throw it out there.
Sure.
There's often, and it's come across in the countrywide discussion board about divestment, the problem of sort of, especially engineering departments get a lot of grants and such from these fossil fuel companies for research and for students get their scholarships and such through these. How do we counter arguments that are trying to say don't divest because they'll take away our grant money?
The Canadian Association of University Teachers just put out a big report on this about the corporate influence on campuses and this precise question. So, again, it's a bigger, longer-term issue that we'll have to deal with, but I don't know. To the extent that it comes up, embrace it, and maybe kind of shine a light on those pernicious dynamics. Because oftentimes you hear the argument that, well, we're just taking the money, but we have academic freedom. It doesn't influence our agenda. We're independent. Researchers, and if you can show that that's not actually the case and document that, then that helps not just here but in other campuses as well.
Do we have any other questions?
I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that letter instead of the pension fund managers to Topo and Gas Company.
Yeah, so it was, Carbon Tracker was one of the proponents of the letter, and this other NGO called CERES, C-E-R-E-S. And it's just a really nicely crafted letter in terms of, laying out the argument, straight up and just, asking them to justify in that context the capital expenditure plans that they have. They issued it and they've kind of gotten some sort of, apparently I've heard that the response they've gotten back has been fairly positive, but I don't know, it may be a bit of like, okay, yeah, we're thinking about these things, go back to sleep. So we'll see what happens, but I think it's an important development that those pension funds are actually asking those questions, and for other endowments and pension funds, they need to be asking those questions too, and if they're not, then we can argue that they're not actually properly managing their funds for the long term.
I think Shell's response to that letter was the most telling, because their response to the letter was, "Don't worry about it." The letter specifically pointed at bitumen and oil sands and high carbon fuels and tar sands, and Shell's response was, "Don't worry about it. It won't impact our ability to pursue new projects." They didn't actually answer what are you doing about it. Their answer was just it's okay. Look over here. So I think that's kind of telling in that they don't have a response to it. There isn't something, there isn't, and what that shows is that contrary to what will often become the argument for engagement or the argument of corporations or folks who are supporting it, that the market will just transition, and when wind power is a better source, all these fossil fuel companies will start making solar and wind. But that's not going to happen. Their strategy and their business model is fossil fuels and to do it as long as they can. So I think that that's kind of the really telling piece of it, is that they don't have it, they don't have an answer, and their business model is based on not having an answer. So I think that that's one of the best examples of how it was responded to.
I think Shell was number 3 or 4 on that list of the top 90 that cost the call.
Another question?
I was reading an article earlier this afternoon that the Fraser Institute had released a report essentially saying that First Nations, they didn't really say it like this, but what they indicate is that First Nations are a major block to every major natural resource development in Canada, which was funny to see from the Fraser Institute, but I wonder if there's a connection to, I know you're talking about that there is obviously economic argument for divestment, but also in terms of the very real situation that First Nations may well be using the courts to stop a lot of resource development in Canada, and that is going to affect the bottom line companies. It already is. I mean, all the pipeline protests and everything else that's going on is affecting their ability to develop. So I wonder if there's a place, if you think there's a place to talk about that as well, and do you think that is a real risk, or is that just something that
I think
Fraser Institute seems worried about?
I think it's very real, particularly out in BC, where we don't have treaties. To me, anything that I can do as an individual or as in my work to support the struggles of those First Nations, then I think that's totally the way to go. Coming back to the conversation here, I think it's one of many reasons of elevating the risk associated with investing in tar sands or fracking or LNG. So, there's risk of First Nations land claims, there's regulatory delays. Keystone has been delayed for 4 years. This was a slam dunk, and it's been delayed for 4 years. Enbridge has been delayed, and so I think the industry's, there is a chill in the industry. The other ones, the carbon risk of it coming under some sort of management, and then the potential liability risk associated with that well. And that liability could cut a couple different ways. It could be, for example, the Beaver Lake Cree or the Athabasca Chippewa in northern Alberta, who are suing for direct damages to their health and communities associated with tar sands development, forgetting about climate for a side, but also the liability aspect of the putting that stuff in the atmosphere and what that means. And again, it's a bit foggy how that might play out in the courts, but it's certainly something that should be a chill to investors, and that's what we really want to communicate, is that this is just too risky.
Yeah, and it's litigation, but also just as like one really recent example, when the blockades began in Elsipogtog with Southwestern Energy, when the first police action happened on that blockade, Southwestern Energy's stock dumped. It absolutely bottomed out and has never recovered. And the biggest thing of that is that there's a realization that up against an assertion of land rights, resource companies are in big trouble. And a lot of investors, when they see that, and when they see that it's going to become a conflict, will just dump straight out of that project or that company. And what that helps to drive the stock down, and it helps, as Mark said, is just continuing this narrative of risk. And there is a report coming out sometime in early 2014, I have no idea what the timeline is right now, that specifically assesses the economic risk of developing on contended or unceded First Nations land. And it's going to it's using some of the court cases and how they've slowed down some of the developments in the tar sands like Jack Pine and Pierre River, the Shell projects, and how much money they've actually cost them. And the other piece of it, I think, that's really good to build this in also, and just having this public narrative of risk, is one of the things that I guess is sort of a wonderful thing a tool for us about economics that may not be the best thing about, just generally how stocks and kind of markets ebb and flow, is a lot of the times rumors lead to, and talking about risk creates real risk. So we don't actually need fire. The more smoke we create, the more real risk actually is there. The more people are saying it's risky to invest in fossil fuels, the more people are like, maybe it is risky to invest in fossil fuels. Invest in them. So that becomes more and more of an actual risk because we're saying there's risk. There is risk, and we're not just making this up, but it does help that, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes.
Is it possible though that, there's so many things that influence stocks, right? So is there anybody tracking what the effect is of First Nations stuff on Enbridge stock? Or it's pretty complicated. You can't make a clear-cut case yet that yes, look, here's the risk because of First Nations claims, environmental damage. This is what happens to stock prices. I don't think you can make that direct line.
Well, I think that's the point Cam was making, was that even just the incident.
No, but
in
I'm saying
Brunswick.
there's so many effects though. Like Enbridge stock has gone down, but that's also because Iran. There's a treaty with Iran. So I don't think you can't really say black and white that this is the causes, this is the effect of the stock market.
But there's the Beaver Lake
Play
Cree
that
horses case is going to court next year after kind of stonewalling by the federal and Alberta governments for years, and a positive. Now that would take many steps to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, but I think that would actually, a decision there will have an impact on their price the day after. I'm sure that
Which First Nation?
the Beaver Lake Cree.
In New Brunswick?
Northern Alberta.
Oh, from the tar sands.
Yeah, they are one of the First Nations whose traditional lands just happen to be the tar sands.
And I think the other part of it is, and this is where I think it's always important to kind of recognize the necessity of the organizing side of divestment, that it's not just like, hey, look, we have the best argument. but that we also need to build power to be able to revoke social license through these campaigns, because we're not going to economically bankrupt Exxon. We're not going to economically undermine Enbridge's ability to exist as a company just by divestment campaigning. But when we revoke the social license of the entire fossil fuel industry and specifically take away companies' ability to do this, that's this X factor that no one can calculate for. And so if a company is considered toxic, their ability to operate, and that means their ability both to raise the resources to pursue new projects, but I think especially important for what we're doing, the political situation. If a company or an industry is considered toxic, their bankrolling of political candidates and political projects also becomes toxified. I think that happened with tobacco, with Philip Morris funding companies or funding politicians who would go in and lobby against legislation to put warning labels on cigarette packages, or to really put that forward. And that became toxic. And that was a very specific outcome of a lot of things like divestment from tobacco companies. Same thing with South Africa. And that's this tool that it hits them economically, but it also hits the most important thing they have right now, which is this ability to act with impunity in our politics and in our environments, because that's what's allowing, especially in this country, the perpetuation of these kind of petro-state politics. And so there's these other pieces that go further into it that sort of show how this is an economic focused campaign that has an economic aspect, and divestment as a tool is economic, but it's also political and social. And those two, when they're successful in that, have a feedback loop into the economic and make it harder and harder for these projects to keep building.
To sort of just comment on that, one of the things that I think makes these campaigns so successful and gain so much traction is the economic and the number side of it. When I went to see the Do the Math screening earlier this year at the Bloor Cinema, you guys have seen it, but it struck me as like the sort of the most successful environmental case for divestment because of those three numbers that they put forward. Because we're rational creatures, right? So that gives everybody something to get behind, rather than, oh, it's bad, or oh, we're all gonna die, or oh, we're gonna, it's a real tangible thing that people can get behind, and that's what I think, will make it kind of move forward. So just comment on that.
And that's something that 350.org as an organisation from the start, its very name is a science-based thing. Let's take the science, let's take these facts and these figures, and then make that into something that is easily digestible and really speaks to the reality of the world. Got a question?
Yeah, this for Mark or Ken. What are, in your views, what are the thoughtful arguments against divestment? What are the ones that that you're hearing from people who are on the fence, or I'm just curious.
Well, I think the main one is that engagement argument. That is that, we should hold on to our stock and then show up at the company shareholder meetings and ask polite questions and, present some facts and, that kind of thing. I think there's a split on that. I'm willing to work with that, in the sense that there's a bit of an insider-outsider strategy. So there's a lot of people kind of mobilizing on the outside, calling for divestment. And maybe that gives more credence to those arguments that are made on the inside. But like I said before, I'm pretty skeptical about whether that works at all.
Yeah, and I think that, and this has been one of the most surprising things, is that one of the biggest bases of arguments back against divestment has been from the socially responsible investment industry, because they've never been forced to deal with climate and carbon as something that's a qualifier of socially responsible or even environmentally responsible investing in most cases. So in a lot of cases, they have never had the social pressure to have to actually come up with a divested investment option. And so the first reaction was just this is impossible. And now we're starting to see a little bit of movement of people begrudgingly starting to put it together. But that's definitely, there's a kind of range of arguments that are somewhat hard to deal with in that sense, because there's never been this kind of pressure on the reinvestment side for folks who kind of manage that and work in that and do a lot of this work to address these issues. So it's even folks who we would consider to probably be natural allies, and who I thought would be natural allies as the start as we get going, that have kind of expressed that. But I think we're starting to see a shift, and the more these campaigns go and the more social pressure builds up and kind of simmers, the quickly that these things are going to come out. And we're already seeing it in the US, where like Trillium Asset Management and there's been some of these other investment groups that have kind of stepped forward to say like, hey look, like we're going to be leaders on this instead of just telling you why we can't do it. And I think we're getting to that point in Canada where some folks are finally being like, this isn't going away. This is starting to grow. We should probably address this and figure it out. And the other reason it's slower moving is just our investment mixes tend to scale and skew a bit higher in terms of extractive and fossil fuel in the mix than in the US. It's about 3% US to 10 and up, depending on what the investment is in Canada. And so I think there's that piece that's starting to play out, but I think one of the best things about that is, the underlying part of all of this in the argument is kind of the repetition of our government's line of, like fossil fuels are our economy, which isn't true on one hand, but they are a big part of investment. And then I think what people are realizing with the economic argument is like, holy shit, this is our economy. And there's this massive economic risk to it, so we need to figure out the way out so we're not left holding the bag at the end of the game of musical chairs of who gets stuck holding all of these stocks.
But just to follow on that, there's like, and it comes back to this social responsible investing stuff, which sounds good. So there's this whole thing called the UN, United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing. Sounds great. And this kind of came up in some work Cam and I were doing with the city of Vancouver, which is now challenging it's the main manager of the pension funds for the public sector in BC. It's called the BC Investment Management Corporation. So the BC IMC has all of this bump about, we're members of the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. And then if you look at their top 10 investments, they've got like the most egregious companies, in the world. I mean, they've got Shell, they've got Canadian Natural Resources, which is this company that's been responsible for this basically uncontrolled tar sand spill that goes, back to May. I don't know if it's been in the news here, but it's been really big back home. They've got Enbridge and Kinder Morgan. So, it's hard to come to the conclusion that that UN PRI framework has led to any positive developments whatsoever. And typically those socially responsible investment vehicles are like, well, okay, yeah, no tobacco, no military, and then the rest is like what they call sort of best in class. So, when you look at it critically, it doesn't really hold up. But there's a whole industry of people who are making, 6-figure salaries by peddling this stuff too.
When we're talking about risk too, like I think you may have already mentioned this, but I'm not sure. But it's not just the risk of the long-term predictable consequences of putting carbon when we know, the negative effects, but also the immediate explosive risk of how a lot of these corporations do their operations, because they're usually huge scale and they're often using technologies not fully proven and often ignoring safeguards. Like with BP and the explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, that company almost disappeared overnight, and that wasn't any moral problems or governments cracking down on them, it's just their operations were inherently risky, So there's that risk for investors too, more so than in other industries.
Yeah, just, some of the economics that I've been reading recently has been talking about fossil fuel supply and sort of the global dynamic of fossil fuel prices. And certainly one of the best ways to mitigate climate change using a market would be to have super high fossil fuel costs. In terms of the cost of a barrel of oil, right, is going to trigger investment in all sorts of new things if it's all of a sudden completely uncompetitive. So where do you see the cost of fossil fuels going if all of a sudden an opinion is adopted that we can't burn most of what we have? How would that affect the price, and what's your economic outlook on what that would do?
Good question. Hard to know how that would actually play out. My sense is that we do want to be driving the price ever higher through things like carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and that has the double advantages of providing us the revenues that we need to be able to invest in alternative infrastructure. So building up public transit and building retrofits and other sort of green manufacturing. So that's the key dynamic for me. I think that also relates a little bit back to what Cam was just saying, which is like one of the dangers we face is that the proponents from the industry, they're talking about specific projects, multi-billion-dollar investments that are going to create, thousands of jobs. Often the numbers are totally inflated, but nonetheless, there are, jobs and economic impacts and revenues for governments that are associated with that. And sometimes, you're like, oh, we should have green jobs instead, which kind of sounds like not very comforting. And arguably, the last BC election was won on those arguments in the interior of the province. So we need to be a lot more specific about what it is we want to build. To get to the world that I think we should have, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of investment, and that's good, right? Because people need jobs. But we need kind of a framework that allows us to do it. So to some extent, you need to kind of anchor that back into some sort of industrial policy that's driving us towards low carbon, and that would basically sort of like manage the price of fossil fuels in the short term and take that volatility out of there. Recognize that we have to burn some fossil fuels to get where we gotta get, but to try to do it so that we're adding a lot of value to it. We're being really strategic in how we move to where we want to be, and not just kind of like rip it out for whatever foreign buyers will pay down in the States or Asia or whatever.
I guess sort of continuing on that, what do you see the end game of this being? Because if we're defunding these companies, will this money be directed somewhere else that's equally malicious, but really not within the scope of this, or do you think that money will be redirected into more positive?
Well, yeah, I mean, that kind of engagement argument, like with the pension fund letter, is trying to push companies to take their capital investment plans. And there's something like, 600 and something billion last year invested in new exploration in fossil fuels. Take that capital investment and invest it into renewables. Like even Enbridge has like a green energy division. So I think you'd want to give the companies the opportunity to rechannel their investments, but clearly in some cases they don't want to do it. If it means at the end of the day that fossil fuel stock prices drop by 90%, the key for me is making sure that it's not I don't have a pension fund, but it's not the pension funds that are getting burned by that. It's the Koch brothers. If they lose 90% of the value of their wealth, fucking awesome. But the end game, yeah, I don't know. It's a big mystery.
I think on a more micro level, one of the things that we've started to see emerge in this idea of like reinvestment as a strategy for how these campaigns evolve, I think is really important, and how we're able to articulate it. Because, so for example, at a campus, one way that it could be reinvested would be shifting what currently is a large kind of chunk of the investment pie in stocks, shifting that to more revolving loans or bonds that help to do, en masse energy retrofits on a campus, or creating self-sustaining energy systems on a campus that may save billions of dollars over the long term and be able to kind of maintain in that sense. So that's one side of it, and I think it's really important in knowing the power of that, in seeing things like, for example, the fact that U of T has a divestment policy. McGill has something similar with CAMSR. There's things like Harvard had things, and a lot of what exists now on campuses, which are these policies on divestment or reinvestment or socially responsible or ways to trigger it, were reactions that came out of anti-apartheid and anti-tobacco divestment campaigns. So the fact that these campaigns were successful actually created a long-term policy system or entity on campuses to address this moving forward. So I think there's an opportunity now with fossil fuel divestment to possibly look at, victory leading into the creation of kind of long-term institutes or programs or policies that allow these things to be carried forward and allow this to become something that goes into a question of how are we reinvesting as being a kind of community visioning process or whatever it happens to be, that this is more than just kind of like take money out of X and put it into Y. This is a way of questioning how money moves through universities, how money moves through our system, and I think actually has fundamentally bigger implications in talking about how we address capitalism and things like that, and even on small scales. For example, Unity College, one of the first schools in the US to divest, they got a massive upswing, a huge influx of new donations after they divested. And one of the things they did with that was they created climate justice scholarships. so that youth from like communities currently being impacted by fossil fuel extraction or refining or frontline, communities in the United States could go to school to study things like remediation and transition strategies for their community on a full ride. And so there's this really interesting way that they've kind of reinvested in bringing that in and kind of bettering society by actually the benefits of divestment. So it's just like little things like that I think really present an opportunity to just call the question, how do we reinvest this and keep pushing as this goes forward.
I think it's a bit different because nobody wants any more apartheid and nobody really wants any more tobacco, right? But people do want energy, so I think it's a bit of a different situation.
Yeah, the reality is if all the oil companies shut down tomorrow, there'd be a lot of people dead. Seriously, we rely on energy for our critical.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's saying we need to shut down all the oil companies. We need a multi-decade transition framework that manages those industries for wind down, while at the same time creating sort of plentiful, new job opportunities, building up the stuff that we want. So.
It's also, but in the case of tobacco, like all of the tobacco companies could shut down tomorrow. You'd have a lot of people that were in withdrawal that were angry, but you wouldn't have anywhere near the fundamental societal difference, right?
That was not true when tobacco divestment happened, though. Philip Morris was one of the biggest corporations in the United States at the advent of the tobacco divestment campaign. They were not just making cigarettes. They were making a lot. They were investing in tons. They were a massive corporation that was considered like the family-friendly, warm embrace of American values. They were not just tobacco. I think that, and so there's a few pieces to it. One is that we need to also make sure we are not getting caught up in the Harper-driven narrative that oil runs our economy. Oil production and export in Canada is responsible for somewhere between 2 and 7% of our GDP.
And less than 1% of our employment.
Less than 1% of our employment. There are actually, there was a study done recently, there are more people employed in the nonprofit and charitable sector in Canada than actually working in the oil industry. So I think it's important to not get caught up in that, and also to recognize that no one's saying we're going to shut down the oil industry tomorrow. We're saying we need to transition. Also, on a national scale, about 50% of Canada's energy is already coming from renewable sources. Right now, what's being pushed isn't oil for your cars. It's pushed massive export of unconventional heavy oil, especially tar sands, especially fracking. It's not to say we need this. It's to put a bunch of money. It's not to put gas in cars. It's not to power our society. It's to put money in the pockets of the wealthiest corporations on the planet.
Well,
Go ahead, Nancy.
I have attended a lot of these meetings, and one of the things I find is that the focus is too much on supply side. That we have to cut down the supply, stop the companies from producing. The fact is, supply is driven by demand, and we are not doing anything on the demand side.
Well, I think so.
The question is, why are you focused only on supply and not on demand?
The main reason is that demand-based strategies to address climate change have existed. That's what we've done for 20 years. Changing our light bulbs, shorter showers, that has been the primary strategy of the environmental movement for years, and it was standing from a place that effectively said we don't have an opponent. That this is a fair fight. That if we go up against the biggest companies on the planet, we can beat them by simply saying we don't want this anymore. And it's an idea that I think is just fundamentally flawed in the fact that we are going up against, out of the 9 largest corporations on the planet, or 10 largest corporations on the planet, 9 of them are making oil. The 5 biggest fossil fuel companies on Earth in 2012 made $140 billion in profit. And they have used this profit for the last 20 years to get in the way of every single attempt by environmentalists, by politicians, by movements to deal with this. Climate denial was bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry. And we were on a huge upswing of environmental action at that point in time. We were going there, we were getting policies passed. Climate denial, billions of dollars from the folks pulling this out, dropped it. They knocked the feet out from underneath us. The same thing, look at just in Ontario, the massive kind of anti-wind movement. almost every study that talks about the health problems with wind power funded by the fossil fuel companies. These folks are using, they have effectively unlimited resources to finance this not happening. Absolutely there needs to be demand reduction, and it has been happening, it is happening. There's huge investments in energy efficiency, there's all of this happening. But unless we actually get in the face of the carbon pushers, we cannot stop this. We have to take away their power. And they have, right now, they wield political power, economic power, and social power. And we're going to go up against them, and saying that we're going to reduce supply is playing their game. First thing we have to say we're going to reduce demand is playing their game, and it means that it's not addressing that there is power at play here.
I think you chose the wrong demand targets. A light bulb doesn't have the same impact as a car does. Car is the big consumption symbol, not light bulb. You went out after petty things. I think go after cars. That's where the life changes, and that's where land
I don't think
is.
there's any dispute when we look at the big picture in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and what we need to do as a society. But I mean, this movement is built around divestment, and that's where we are gaining thousands of new people excited about having a specific target to take on, and winnable objectives in terms of universities and pension funds and that sort of thing. Who want to get in?
I guess on a positive note, what can we keep doing? What do we need to do? What kind of critical mass do we need to get to so that this becomes the tobacco of our century?
I mean, to a certain extent, it's just to keep doing what I think everyone is already doing. I think that one of the biggest things that we heard when divestment started taking off was just the fact that for everyone it was finally, I feel like I can win. I think that has so much power, and that we're targeting institutions that people feel they have actual power over, as opposed to this federal government and even provincial governments that can be very difficult to push. One thing I think is that we need to start recognizing and I think that just on a bigger scale, is the pension stuff is going to become really big, and I think that's going to drive a debate in sort of the economic world, and that's going to keep this in the same way as pipelines have been in the business paper every other day for the last year. I think we're going to start to see, as pensions start to talk about this, that happen on divestment and that happen on fossil fuel investments in the bigger picture. I think it's just a matter of getting more people, signing petitions, getting involved, and pushing it forward. And I think that the fact that there's more campaigns kind of within Toronto and nearby starting to come up, and all of this stuff starting to kind of feed together, I think is really just a kind of powerful web that's being built. And as that goes forward, and how we communicate it and how it kind of gets out into the public space is going to be a big one.
North America wide, this is only a year old, this whole campaign. And in Canada, it's a few months old. So, but it's interesting, right? I mean, you have all these campaigns being launched. We have some early victories. We've been trying to obviously campuses are a big point of focus, but municipalities are now there. And with the work we've been doing with the City of Vancouver, they've now opened up this wedge to talk about their management of their pension fund assets, which then allows us to bring in some of the public sector unions who also have their pension funds managed in the same way. And faith groups are starting to get interested in this, and there's someone here who's working on some of those things as well. So I think it's about kind of mustering up all of these different things, and I think it is easy to get frustrated by the pace of change when you look at what's happening in international negotiations and all this. But I mean, the pace of change in this movement, I think, is incredible, and it's a really exciting thing to be a part of. So the fact that you guys are here, were you guys even thinking about this stuff a year ago? Probably not. And now there's a campaign, and the president of UT is going to have to deal with it, right? So that's great, right? Even if it's a no, then I mean, there's still you can still mobilize and keep going and engaging that conversation, and that's so important too. Is the divestment movement allows us to engage the conversation on climate in ways that we have not done so far, with people who need to hear it, and in institutions and kind of movement building. All of those things together, there's a certain alchemy to it, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think the big thing is staying the course. Just really quickly, because we've seen a lot of no's. The U.S. movement has hit a lot of the big schools where we've gotten like, no, we're not going to do it at Harvard for the other round. And the tenacity of students in those campaigns to kind of feel empowered by hearing no, by being that we're hearing no because we're finally making a big enough ask. We're finally making an ask on administration that isn't just kind of window dressing green, communications or, just little things or just greening our operations. It's a fundamental transformative ask that when we win, this isn't just going to be like a little shift, that as we start winning, this is transformative change. And I think that's what's represented by the fact that we've heard no. So just knowing that beforehand and having the kind of, the tenacity is, I think everyone in these campaigns do, and we've seen as with going out to hear no and fight hard.
We've got time for a couple more questions.
The secondary report you mentioned by the pension plans,
So which one,
the pension plan, which kind of identified the long-term risk.
the letter, the series letter?
You mentioned your own report,
Yeah,
but then you also quoted from the other.
that was the letter.
What's the other? No.
Yeah.
Is that widely distributed to the pension fund managers and the risk managers, or is it being really low? I don't have anything else to identify the long-term risk of investing.
Well, and they had amazing media coverage when they released it, and it was a group of pension funds that were asking the question of the companies. So, we were wanting to make sure that all pension funds have to wrestle with these difficult issues. Yeah, they have to do the math, and if you do the math, you're like, whoa, shit.
Well, recently, I don't know if you've heard of Bitcoin, alternative currencies. I'm asking this question whether you have any opinions about whether that sort of decentralized, take the government out of the equation one day, maybe if Bitcoin or some sort of alternative currency get into people's hands, especially maybe gaining popularity in Canada. Do you think this may benefit the divestment campaign in some form of way?
I don't know about Bitcoin. I mean, I think Bitcoin right now is a speculative bubble, and that's kind of part of the problem with financial markets is that they tend to like inflate things, and everyone's kind of making money on it. But I think the more revolutionary part of it when it comes to clean energy is around like community-based energy systems, so that you're actually getting off the grid as much as possible and generating power through district energy and solar panels, or maybe there's a bit of wind in there, and it's scalable at different levels as well. And I think that in terms of those kind of cooperatives that are forming around that, they need upfront capital, and so there's an opportunity to transition money that's in fossil fuels into those type of investments that may just pay like a simple 3 to 4% rate of return. It's not like buying an ownership stake and benefiting as it appreciates, but it's like more like a bond. So I could definitely see that the typical portfolio of a pension fund or institution is shifted away from equities and more towards bonds. And I think to the extent you can support those type of energy initiatives, that's good long-term as well in terms of our resilience to climate change as well.
Yeah, I think that the other end of this has so much possibility, and kind of fundamentally at the core of it, it's fossil fuels, oil and coal especially, have, at least for the past 100 years, been the single largest force in centralizing wealth in a small number of hands. And so the fact is that no fossil fuel company can make as much money as a renewable energy company. It just won't work. You just can't make the money that's currently in oil, coal, and gas in the same sort of intensity and small scale. That renewable energy and a shift in addressing these issues requires investment in community, city, or even like home-based one-by-one energy production. So if we're democratizing energy use, the fact is that we are undermining the source of capital of the largest corporations on the planet. And I think that's I don't know what that means, and I don't know what that could lead to, but there's somewhat of kind of, there's a big open-ended question there of what kind of world are we building when we come through this. And this isn't just about taking down a coal plant and putting up a windmill. There's huge social implications of how we do that and what kind of world can be built by forcing that transition,
which divestment starts to get us the ability to do so by both liberating capital from fossil fuels to put into community-based solutions, as well as also significantly undermining the political and social ability of fossil fuel companies to run rampant across, our society.
And undermine centralization of capital, that's important.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. It's a good place to leave it, and if you're talking about the democratization and it's open-ended. And also, it's really exciting to see that we are bubbling with questions. A big thank you to Marc for coming here today. Thank you all for coming, and again, thank you guys for being here.
Yeah.